first step in thinking like a historian is to ask questions about the facts that you're given. So one of the very first questions that you need to ask yourself whenever you're given information is, where did you find that? And the answer should be one of two answers. It's a primary source or it's a secondary source. A primary source is a first-hand account of an event that is created by an eyewitness or a first record, so the very first record or a recording of what was going on at that event in that time. So while the event was happening, this is what we see. So let's take, for instance, the sinking of the Titanic. A primary source would be a letter that was written from a survivor at the sinking of the Titanic to somebody telling their account of what happened. A secondary source would be an account of events created at a later date, somebody that wasn't at the scene. So in the case of the Titanic sinking, that would be somebody that collected the letter later on, but they also collected all of the letters from every survivor from the sinking of the Titanic, and they put together a book or some kind of a magazine or something that had all of the different accounts put together in one spot, and then their interpretation of how that all fits together. The last thing is sourcing. That's when you examine who, what, when, where, and why of the document. So that is asking, well, where did you get it? Where did it come from? Who gave it to you? And when was it written? The next thing that we do to look at our sources, where we get our information, the next question we ask if we want to think like a historian is, how did it get there? So how did the information get to you? And there are 3 different skills that you can use in order to figure that out: contextualizing, corroboration, and close reading. So let's look at the first one, contextualizing. That is taking into consideration how the person that wrote the document or gathered the information was influenced by when and where the document was produced. So what that means is you have to take into account the different things that were happening while that person was writing the story. So if somebody was writing their account of the sinking of the Titanic while the sinking of the Titanic was happening, they might be a little bit stressed while they're writing that document. Next is corroboration. Corroboration is taking 2 different sources and comparing them so that you can, 1, figure out, is this an accurate account? That means, are they telling the truth? 2, evaluate the validity of the source. That means one of them could be good and one of them could be bad. So if you have as many sources as you possibly can gather, then you're going to be able to figure out, well, which one is more accurate. The next thing that you can use corroboration for is to consider multiple perspectives. So seeing things from other people's viewpoints makes you able to understand them a lot better and to understand what was going on in the minds of the people in the event that you're studying. The next thing is close reading. That's as simple as it sounds. You read the document closely, or you look at the picture closely, critically examining the significant details, how the person that wrote the document used language, and you put things in context to develop a deeper meaning behind what happened using a document. The next question that you need to ask yourself about the facts that you have been given is, says who? And what's going on here? And what I mean by that is, if you are actively looking for information, then sometimes you get this answer of, they say, and that tells you nothing, because first of all, we need to know, who are they? Also, it's good to understand what is going on around the person who is giving you the information. So the first thing we need to look at is point of view. If you can pick out point of view, then this is a good skill to becoming a historian and thinking like a historian. Finding somebody's point of view, and that is their opinion or their perspective. It is the way that that person sees the world. So the author of different documents are going to give you information that can look a little bit different from somebody else who is witnessing that same event. The document can be influenced by the author's personal circumstances. So, a good example of this, back to the sinking of the Titanic, you can get a different perspective from somebody who is a sailor that was on the deck of the ship whenever the boat started to sink than, say, the perspective of a mother who is holding her child that's getting into a lifeboat. They're going to see this event with two very different eyes. One is going to be very tactile. That means they're going to look at the situation and be able to react because they are a skilled sailor. So they probably will give you the information like a sailor would. But the mother is probably going to be pretty fearful, pretty stressed out because she is holding her child. She wants her child to survive. That's a completely different point of view. The next thing that we want to look at is frame of reference. Frame of reference is the personal attributes and the life experiences of an author and how that might affect their point of view. So this could be somebody's personal beliefs. It could have been an event, a life event that happened to them that affects the way that they see the world. So in the same situation with the sinking of the Titanic, there might have been somebody on board who had somebody in their family drowned as a child. So they might be very, very fearful of what's going on. So their account of the event, it might be from a survival mode type of point of view. Or it could be somebody who is very religious and they talk about how it's only the Lord that got them through. So frame of reference is those personal experiences, personal beliefs that are going to change the way that the author is going to make you see how the event happened. The last thing that we want to look at for this part is historical context. That is the circumstances of the time in which a person that was writing that document that was an account of what happened, that event, the circumstances around them in the time that they lived. So not just their personal life, but in the rest of the world too. So how is the world events around that person writing about that event that's happening affect the way that they are going to put their point of view on a piece of paper? So in our case, we might be able to write some kind of document recording how we go back to school, but people are going to have to understand that we're going back to school while there is a virus going on called COVID-19. So people will look back on the way that we went back to school and they'll have that historical context of that was happening at the time. So things might be a little bit different going back to school than they were even a year ago. Historical context. The last thing that you do to think like a historian is you take the information that you've been given, the facts, and you ask, well, what do we do with that? This is also called investigation techniques. So the first thing is an inquiry. You seek out the truth, information, or knowledge. It's an investigation as into an event through research. So this might be your Blue's Clues moment where you look at clues and then you try to put them together. So this is just the collecting of the clues. The next thing that you would look at is interpretation. So this is understanding the facts to form an explanation of the event. So this is putting the clues together and trying to figure out what Blue's talking about. If you don't know what I'm talking about here, there's a children's show called Blue's Clues. Go YouTube it. Anyway, interpretation is you taking all of the facts, putting them together, and trying to form a picture of how the event went down. Then you make a thesis statement. That means you say, hey, I think that this is how this happened. I think this is how this went down, and I can prove it based off of my facts from my inquiry. So really your thesis statement is you putting together your interpretation and explaining why you think it went down that way. All right, and then the last thing that you need to look at is called periodization. That is the use of an event's time period or an era in order to make an inference. So that's one of those if and then type statements. If this happened during the civil rights movement, then that means that, and then you could give an inference there. So when you infer, that means that you put events together and say, hey, if this happened, then that means this too. So, for instance, you could say, I went to Papa Nacho's this weekend. Then we can assume, or we can infer, if you went to Papa Nacho's, then that means you probably ate chips and salsa. Just going to put that out there. I guess I'm getting hungry. I don't know. So periodization is whenever you do that same thing, but with a time period. So if we go back to our example of the sinking of the Titanic, what you could do is say, well, I know that the sinking of the Titanic happened during a transition period in U.S. history called the Progressive Era, and that's where people were trying to make their lives better. So I can assume that there's probably some people on that boat that were trying to better their lives. They were doing something to try to make their lives a little better than it was the day before. Now you could also say, oh, well, this is getting kind of close to the Roaring Twenties when we talk about the sinking of the Titanic. So maybe there were some people that were very, very wealthy, or maybe people that were trying to look like they were wealthy. You can infer based off of a time period. That's called periodization. Another good practice is to ask the question, why are you studying the things that you're studying? And the reason why we ask why, I know that some teachers might not want you to ask why, but I don't want you to ask me why. I want you to ask yourself why. And you should come to some conclusions. So the first thing is that social studies is about people, about humans, and how they interact with one another, how they interact with the world, with the earth. And that's very important because you are a human, and you are a person, and you are an individual. So who you are adds to the collective of social studies. That means it adds to the information that we study. So if you want to be part of that, then you need to study social studies. It helps us to understand each other and even to understand yourself a little bit better. And I always get this answer, we should study social studies because we don't want to repeat the mistakes of history. Okay, that sounds great. I don't want you to repeat the mistakes of history either, but I don't want you to forget about the good stuff. And what I mean by that is there's some things in history that are really worth repeating. So if you want to know what those are, then you need to study in this class. The next thing that we need to talk about is you need to understand patterns. And patterns is not history repeating itself. Patterns are whenever something looks familiar from the past that's going on right now. And you're going to see that a lot because we are at a time in history on our timeline, like today, that some major events are happening. And it happens about every 50 years, every 20 years. It just depends on what it is that the pattern is. And in our case, you have a lot of there's a lot of change that needs to happen, a lot of change that people want. And this is the same kind of instance that you saw like in the 1960s, and before that it was the 1860s. So you want to keep an eye out for those type of patterns because you can kind of predict what's going to happen next, but you can also have really good input on how we can successfully make those changes. All right, so the next thing that you would want to think about is on that why should you care? And we've already talked about that a little bit. That is because you are a human. If you are a human, then that means that you want to be invested in what is going on in your time period and the time periods before you were even born, because there is something about understanding one another that makes us build connections with one another. It's like that moment where you find out something brand new about your best friend and you're like, whoa, me too. And then you feel a little bit closer to that person. So social studies helps you build relationships. I had you try to fill in the blank. It was world blank. And I know it's super cheesy, but the word that you fill in there is peace, world peace. And we talked about just a few seconds ago trying to understand one another. Whenever we try to understand one another, what happens is we become invested in one another. And that's how we're able to live peacefully with the humans that are around us. And that's the last question there. Are you human? And the answer is yes. Even if maybe at some point in time you haven't been treated that way, you really are. And you have rights that are worth protecting. And it's my job to be able to teach you what those rights are. They're called human rights. We'll get to that later on next week. But as my job as your social studies teacher, this is why I want you to feel like this is important, because this class is not just about learning about things that happened years and years and years ago. It's also about understanding the world that you live in and being able to protect yourself from people not treating you like a human. So, I know it seems pretty serious. It is, but it's not always going to be that way. We'll go over some really fun stuff. I hope that you have a great day, and I will talk to you on the next one.